Do I want to be cared for by a robot, or do I perhaps need, let's say, the emotional intelligence, the empathy of humans?
How can I take away certain routines from him that he might not enjoy doing anyway?
What can I do with a free version of ChatGPT, for example? Am I allowed to upload company confidential data there? So to put that into perspective,
I believe there are millions of use cases by now. Welcome to a new episode of Digital.Decoded. A warm welcome to you too, Mario. Welcome to our viewers and listeners. I'm very pleased that you've tuned in again and that you're watching. Today, another exciting episode about the topic of AI. And today, Mario, it's about digitalization and artificial intelligence and why forgetting learned knowledge can be helpful. And you recently wrote a LinkedIn article about it, where you discussed the topic a bit more. It also goes back a bit to an event you attended last November. Tell us, when you think about digitalization and artificial intelligence, and especially in the context of why learned knowledge isn't necessarily helpful, what are your initial thoughts on that? Yes, when it comes to artificial intelligence, hello. Again, from my side, André, I always think of a quote. We'll also reveal later where it comes from. But this quote goes, "You must unlearn what you have learned." Why do I find that so great? For one reason, you always notice when talking about artificial intelligence, and both you and I do this every day with clients or business partners. It's a hot topic. You always notice that you're practically stuck in old habits. And at the end of the day, we are all biased, as it's called in modern German. We are used to how things are done, what procedures exist, and what processes are accordingly. And I find it so fascinating that it's really difficult, even for companies to shed these old habits. There are also many process manuals. Everything is written down in detail. And today you have to throw it all overboard and rethink everything because of AI. I notice again and again that many of our clients, but also within our company, including myself, I don't want to exclude myself, find it difficult to change that. And I suspect you have similar experiences, André.
absolutely. When it comes to throwing overboard established structures or known processes, especially when you're trying to drive innovation or optimize processes with technology, in this case with artificial intelligence, fundamentally changing them, it's a very important point to question things. But let's go back and talk about the topic again in a moment. In your article, you also talk about curiosity, but on the other hand, about the uncertainty that naturally arises in the context of artificial intelligence. Could you perhaps elaborate a bit on the topic of curiosity versus uncertainty?
Yes, of course, André. Just a quick note. We'll link the article below in the podcast so you can follow along. There's also a nice diagram in it. Some of you might know it in relation to change management. AI is indeed a typical change management enablement topic. Now I come to your point, André, that you mentioned curiosity and uncertainty, or to both points. You can absolutely sense that curiosity is present in the market, also in every individual person. People are actually looking forward to the possibilities of AI. By now, it has also arrived in daily life, whether it's hearing about care robot or just this week is the HMI in Hanover. You see, of course, many things that nowadays are also entering daily life. According was just announced that WhatsApp has also integrated AI. Every user base is currently getting it installed. My wife said to me just yesterday, suddenly WhatsApp is talking to me and I don't even want that. And that brings us to the second point. So first, she was curious, but the second thing is my wife, for example, is not someone who always has to be at the forefront of the digital way. She handles it well, but there's also a certain level of insecurity. What happens to my data? Where do they go? Who suddenly looks at them? Especially now, of course, WhatsApp involves data going to America, but there's also a TikTok shop being announced where artificial intelligence is naturally being used and integrated. The data is stored in China, and naturally everyone is asking, what happens to all the data and what is done with it? And at the end of the day, all of this is secure.
Yes, you're addressing a very important point. I think a lot of this uncertainty also stems from the fact that the complexity of such technologies is difficult to understand, especially for people who are not necessarily familiar with technology or all the related contexts, like perhaps you and I are. Naturally, many questions arise, and whenever you have questions, uncertainties naturally emerge. However, I must say that the topic of data protection is a very, very important issue for me, Mario, especially when it comes to which data is being used, whether it's my personal data or my company's data to train any AI models there. You just touched on a very interesting point, namely that AI is everywhere, technology is everywhere. The word care robot. We've often discussed in previous episodes the role of humans. So when I think about the topic of care robots, it makes my hair stand on end a bit. I wonder, Mario, when I'm old and dependent on care, do I want to be cared for by a robot, or do I need let's say, the emotional intelligence the empathy of humans? What do you think about it?
I feel the same way. I think empathy is indeed important, but I recently saw a report and I found it very, very interesting. It was exactly about the topic, André, of care robots and artificial intelligence in caregiving. And everyone knows, it's been in the newspapers for years, that we have a nursing shortage. That means we have far too few people who, on one hand, choose the profession. It is simply sometimes not attractive due to the working hours and the pay. You really need to have a calling for it. And on the other hand, of course, the demand for care is rising extremely because naturally more and more people are becoming in need of care. And I found that quite interesting. There are now nursing homes that do the following. They use robots to practically also provide conversation partners. You can clearly see, due to the lack of capacities in care, there is no time anymore. Everything is scheduled. And the caregivers no longer have the opportunity to have a conversation with the elderly. Now, robots or AI robots are really coming into practice, and their role today is to be conversation partners. The AI remembers, on one hand, the AI understands what is being said, and on the other hand, it can now put it into context very, very well. It also remembers the conversations, of course, and as a result, they are very, very well accepted by the elderly. They say quite pragmatically, which I found really great in the report. An elderly lady, for example, said, well, the caregivers simply don't have the time anymore in date. So I now chat with this little friend here, and it even had a name. And of course, they were aware that it was an AI robot, but they said, well, better it than no one. And I found that really great.
Yes, and I think that's an interesting aspect. In the past, I had a similar case where it involved really sick and disabled children who are born with a very, very severe handicap, namely not being able to breathe independently. And there is a very nice children's home in Munich that takes care of these children with great affection, the children's home Atemreich in Munich. And back then, we considered how we could address exactly this nursing shortage that you just mentioned, but also the fact that, of course, the caregivers have less and less time, yes, because there are naturally few of them, and because the different situations of the children are really so varied and complicated. And technology can naturally help to store and interpret these various signals from the different devices on one hand, and also provide caregivers with appropriate indications where something might be wrong, where they should perhaps take a closer look, etc. And I think this is also a nice example where technology complements humans at the end of the day, relieving them of stress, namely the stress of having to care so intensively for one person and perhaps not having time for another person, even though they also need it. This is where technology can be used to make my time more effective and efficient, allowing me to focus on my strengths as a human, namely empathy or analytical skills, to really put these different things into context. So I also believe that car Mario can be an interesting topic. What I still struggle with, Umas, a bit is whether I really want to talk to a robot later on, but I think that's probably a matter of preference or perhaps habit.
Exactly, André. That brings us back to the saying, forget what you have learned before, yes, because I must not forget one thing, the robots or the artificial intelligences are also getting better and better.
Yes.
I had already mentioned that we are also working with Paloa. They are doing speech and voice AI. And I can tell you, we've done several pilots now. You don't notice any difference anymore.
Yes.
You really have to indicate that it's a voice AI because you think you're talking to a completely normal person. And that is admirable or remarkable, to put it better.
Yes.
I think that's something that will become very prominent.
Yes, great keyword, Mario. Keyword, use cases. Forget what you learned before. So you have to change things. Things will change. And I believe that if you currently talk to companies, talk to customers, but also, of course, look at the press, more and more use cases are emerging around the topic of artificial intelligence, but it is still criticized that there are far too few use cases. What is your take on that?
I believe there are millions of use cases by now. And every company is, of course, specific and also has its own use cases, although you can also see that there are enough use cases. So a very simple, understandable one is lead scoring, yes, with AI. That are in the past, it was done normally with BI. Today, it's done with AI. The accuracy is better, and you can really do lead scoring with AI in almost any company where marketing is used. So I think there are enough use cases that are also diverse. For example, we have a use case that we call input management, where unstructured emails are processed. And for example, we use it in insurance companies because their damage reports come in, and the customer, of course, not only describes the damage report, but might also directly say, I want to change my IBAN. And by the way, I saw something else on your website, but it is also universal because actually every company has unstructured emails from customers.
Yes.
And in that sense, I believe there are very, very many cases that are now independent of the industry. But on the other hand, there are also hundreds and thousands of cases that are very, very specific to the respective companies. And of course, it is always important, and I think this is the crux today, to also examine the cost-benefit ratio, because I believe you can implement anything. The question is it still economic? And of course, we've made a huge leap there now. Let's take the topic of voice AI, which I mentioned again. In the past, you had these voice bots, or bots, and you had to put in an enormous amount of effort to really do all these learnings, to input all the rules and so on. Today, with the pre-trained large language models that are offered, OpenAI is the pioneer there. All of that is no longer necessary. And then such a use case suddenly becomes completely different in terms of economics.
Yes, absolutely. I see it that way too. I would say, on one hand, the innovation and the speed of innovation, the technology, the algorithms, the availability of computing capacity, storage capacity, and of course, ultimately, the data have played a major role. But I also believe, what I observe a little, Mario, is that we are now starting, at least I want to say, to think about this innovation the other way around. In the past, we always thought very much from the perspective of technology. So what can technology make possible? And I believe that now in many companies, we are starting to think from the perspective of people, employees, customers, and partners. Do you see it that way too?
Yes, a very important point, André. I have developed a concept. I call this the intelligent workplace. This can be created, for example, for sales employees, marketing staff, or in service and other areas. And that is exactly the thought process you just mentioned. You start from the employee and consider, how can I make the employee's life easier through artificial intelligence? How can I take away certain routines from them that they might not enjoy doing anyway? So, for example, if I'm in sales and I'm going to visit a customer, I first have to familiarize myself with the customer. Then I search the internet. I search my CRM system, which I don't really like using anyway, and so on. And these are things that, if we're honest, no one really enjoys doing. And artificial intelligence can take over these tasks. And the employee, as you nicely mentioned earlier, can then really focus on considering, okay, does this make sense? The employee knows the customer, and how exactly do I want to present this to them? And then we're really engaged in value-adding activities. And that's when it gets exciting. But I also have another question for you, André, because you mentioned earlier that we both are experts and we understand artificial intelligence quite well. I don't know about you. For me, it's often like this. I really have respect, and artificial intelligence is often still a black box for me, even though I deal with it every day. It's still a black box for me, and I wouldn't claim or assume that I understand it 100%, especially because the pace of innovation is so fast. How is it for you?
I can only absolutely agree with you on that. I mean, I also give many lectures on the topic of artificial intelligence and the role it plays for companies. And before each of these lectures, Mario, I naturally think about what has happened in the last weeks, months. And I'm always truly amazed. I'm sometimes even shocked at how fast the pace of innovation is and how difficult it is, or how difficult I find it to keep up with and understand these innovations in that area. On the other hand, what I also notice is that when you go into companies or attend lectures, the knowledge that we both have had to acquire due to our roles, due to our profession, is significantly more than what is present in companies today, I would say. Completely normal and not a reproach at all. And of course, there are numerous experts, Mario, who understand artificial intelligence much better than we do. And also the topic, how is it developing further? What possibilities are there to understand it significantly better? But I believe that what we can assess quite well based on our experience and our affiliation with the company through many customer projects is to categorize this innovation, to concretize the use case, and also to tell companies where it can be most effectively applied. But back to your question, Pufahl, I am always amazed at what is possible there in such a short time. And I mean, I don't know if you noticed, a few weeks ago, OpenAI made what was previously possible in DALL-E, that is image generation, now available in the regular GPT 4.5 chat. And with DALL-E, you always had the challenge that if you wanted to generate images with some kind of text or something like that, some sign or a board with text, it was always very, very difficult to do, if not impossible. And OpenAI can now do that excellently based on the normal ChatGPT interface. You can even insert finished slides somewhere and say, act as if I had given a presentation, but with this or that slide. So really fascinating. And therefore, yes, I agree with you. You have to engage with it. To some extent, you have to deal with it. But on the other hand, I also believe that the opportunities offered by new technologies with artificial intelligence deserve to be engaged with, because it's up to us, Mario. Let's return to the topic of humans and technology. We humans decide how we use the technology and what we ultimately use it for. And I believe it is our task to ensure that we use it in a way that helps people, provides productivity advantages, and so on, ultimately bringing more profits to the company. And humans and technology is indeed a nice topic. You also return to this in your article. So on one hand, it is essential to involve the employees to focus on people and to bring the topic of humans and technology a bit closer together. And I believe you have shared some very exciting insights in your article.
Yes, absolutely. I also want to talk about the limitation because, of course, an important point is to involve the employees. I agree with you on that. Just yesterday, we also had the topic we are a provider of AI. And whenever I talk to my employees, the first objection often is that the employees say, I still need to be further enabled. And I think we've already done 30 enablement sessions, and I believe we can do 100 more. At the end of the day, this is naturally, we come back to this uncertainty, the employees' need for security. I actually need to know everything about it so that I can, in my case, of course, we are salespeople, sell it. That's one thing. The second thing is, the employees also have certain fear. What does that mean for me? Even if we use it internally, positions will be rationalized. And it's important to really improve this knowledge, to keep the motivation high, and to learn that through the use of technology, it can be something very positive for me. But it also has certain limitations. I'll take your example, André, what you said earlier about the images. Our company is called Digital with 2 L's and artificial intelligence. Can't manage that. Whenever we can also proceed with the text. We can input images and so on. The artificial intelligence says, no, that's a typo. I have to correct it, and changes it to digital with 1 L. So, and from the perspective of artificial intelligence, that's correct. But it doesn't understand that our company name is written with 2 L's. We can't get that into the image. We always have to manually add it afterwards. That's one thing. And the second limitation, you just mentioned it. I'd like to briefly touch on it again before we conclude with the quote at the end. But maybe we can revisit a point, André. The limitation of people. You mentioned earlier that there aren't many people who are proficient in the field of artificial intelligence. And what I feel in companies including our own, is that we don't have many ambassadors, as it's called in modern German, who really drive the topic of artificial intelligence forward. Ideally, every employee should be in Chow, but it's impossible to get everyone there because of these issues. People also fear for their own jobs. Sometimes you don't see the added value. You're caught up in your daily business, just like I am. And there, I believe, will be the limiting factor for artificial intelligence. You can't implement it as quickly as you actually should. And I'd be interested in your opinion on that, André.
Yes, I think you just mentioned those enablement sessions. I believe they are important, and that the company or any company would be well advised to provide information about them. For example, what can I do with a free version of ChatGPT? Am I allowed to upload company confidential data there? So to fundamentally categorize that, and also to consider what possibilities within the framework of artificial intelligence I provide to my employees and what the different use cases are. And that is exactly my experience, Mario. I have seen many companies where the paid version of a ChatGPT or Copilot was then made available. And it was simply provided to the employees without specific context, without concrete use cases, and then they were more or less left on their own. And my experience is, Mario, that this always goes wrong, because the frustration that arises because probably various things are not possible, because it doesn't respond the way I want it to, and because it's cumbersome and so on, quickly leads to frustration. I think it would be more sensible to say, so which challenges do we really want to tackle? And you also mentioned earlier that one should think in a human-centered way, meaning involving the employees and really asking the question, what are your biggest challenges? What are the biggest problems? What, for example, consumes the most time? And then to work concretely on these use cases, for example, with Microsoft technologies, but also with other technologies, and to implement them. So that on one hand, the employees can quickly see the impact, meaning the positive contribution of the technology in their daily work. But on the other hand, the company can also grow from it. And I believe that's a very good process to involve the employees, tackle a specific problem, and address a specific challenge, but rather than just providing the technology.
Yes, the interesting thing is, I can tell you from my own experience, we've done all that, and then you realize how many different problems suddenly arise. Every employee has their own problems, and then you quickly move away from AI to the topic of finding some sort of consensus so that everyone can agree on one case or two or three. And that's really quite difficult. But maybe one more thing at the end, André. Let's resolve the quote, if I may start briefly, and then we should also talk about our youth again. So the quote originally comes from a Star Wars movie, specifically from the character Yoda, who was someone very wise, a Jedi Knight. And why do I find the quote so fitting for AI? For me, as a child back then, I remember I was with my grandma in Berlin at the Superlast, and there was a huge screen where these Star Wars movies were shown, and this screen really went along the side. Today, you would say it's like a curved monitor, and for the standards of that time, it was innovative, it was huge, and I think I was 6 years old when I was allowed to see my first Star Wars movie with my grandma, and that was like AI is for me today. It was all new. You can't even imagine how did all these visual effects come about? How did they even do that? And it was a completely uncharted territory. And that's why I find this quote, which doesn't originate from me, someone brought it up at an event in a completely different context. And I practically applied it to AI, and I find it so great in relation to AI. What do you associate with Star Wars from your youth? Do you have any connection to it at all?
Absolutely. Well, I would say Star Wars was something I more or less grew up with back then. A few years ago, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, if I remember correctly. We as a family, I have 2 children. We have this tradition where we watch a series or a film series on during Christmas. And we watch it together as a family over the Christmas holiday. 2 or 3 years ago, I came up with the idea, hey, Star Wars, let's watch that. The old episodes have been remastered and the visual effects look even more amazing now, and so on and so forth. And of course, my kids, who are now 18, didn't know it, but it was still incredibly fascinating to see how these quote unquote Mario old movies still captivate. Even though I knew these movies, I was totally captivated. Those were really wonderful days when we watched those movies there. That immediately comes to mind. And of course, the classic is Yoda. You just mentioned it. Exactly. I've always found him extremely cool with his wisdom, and also how unassuming he is at the end of the day, yet incredibly powerful, intelligent. And that's why I think the quote, "you must unlearn what you have learned," is really good, especially for AI.
Great. With that, we conclude. Thank you for your attention. We hope it was exciting for you. Please, as always, the call to action by like us. Feel free to recommend us, and of course, this podcast as well. André and I would be delighted. I hope you notice we still enjoy it, and we try to share things from our daily lives with you in a simple way. And yes, like, and please recommend us accordingly. And of course, you'll hear from us again in the next episode, and we're looking forward to it.
Take care. Thank you.
See you then.